Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise to speak on this motion. 12 months ago, I rose in this place to speak on the Defence Legislation Amendment Parliamentary Approval of Overseas Service Bill 2014. And 12 months later, I'm here to speak on the same issue again. So 12 months later, after this place first addressed this issue, our constitution has not changed, but Australia is facing an increased and heightened challenge posed by stateless enemies, by Daesh. And it's not just the people of Australia who face this grave threat, but it is also the millions of Syrians and Iraqis who have been displaced and who now need protection from Daesh. Mr Acting Deputy President, there is no greater responsibility for any elected national government than to keep the nation safe and secure, and for making the decision to utilise military personnel in a wide range of roles, both domestically and overseas. Under our Constitution, the decision to deploy troops is clearly the responsibility of the Executive, who are elected by the Australian voters and accountable to them through the Parliament. Additionally, our military forces are accountable to the Executive and to the Crown, not to the Parliament. I believe it is neither within the spirit of our Constitution, and it certainly was not the intent of our founding fathers, after many decades of very considered debate, that executive government would ever consider abrogating their responsibility for the serious decision to deploy Australian Defence Forces in harm's way. Ultimately, in our Constitution and in our country today, in our parliamentary democracy, that is what our executive has been charged with. I personally and willingly and certainly knowingly have served under both Labor and coalition governments in uniform, and throughout my nearly 30 years in uniform, I always understood and accepted that the government of the day, regardless of their party or affiliations, were responsible for making decisions that impacted on not only my service but also the men and women that I served with. And I knew that would possibly impact on my life itself. While I was never deployed, I always knew that I could be, and in fact still could be, and that I had absolutely every confidence, again regardless of who was in government, that the Executive would take the right decision, that they would take into consideration everything that needed to be before they made that decision. I firmly believe that the Commonwealth Constitution is the birth certificate of our nation. It has operated very successfully for over 100 years, and it does provide for the separation of power within Australia between the Commonwealth and the states and between the arms of our government. Chapter 1 of the Constitution sets out the powers of the Australian Parliament, and Chapter 2 with the Executive Government. Section 51(6) of the Constitution gives the Commonwealth the power to make laws with respect to naval and military defence of the Commonwealth and of the several states, and the control of the forces to execute and maintain the laws of the Commonwealth. In addition, as far as I can see, there is no requirement in our Constitution or in any of our defence legislation for parliamentary decisions in most, if not all, aspects of declaring war and the engagement and deployment of our troops. Indeed, former royal prerogatives, including the power to make war, deploy troops and declare peace, are now part of the executive power of the Commonwealth, exercised by the Governor-General on the advice of Federal Executive Council or the responsible ministers. Contemporary practice is that decisions to go to war or deploy troops are matters for the Prime Minister and for Cabinet, and do not directly involve in the decision-making process the Governor-General or the Executive Council. Since the establishment of the National Security Committee of Cabinet in 1996 by John Howard and his government, this body has proven to be the most influential and the most knowledgeable in considering any Australian government decision to commit the Australian Defence Force personnel to domestic operations or overseas deployments. I see absolutely nothing in the Commonwealth Constitution, or as I said, or in defence legislation that requires the Executive to engage in a debate or a vote in Parliament before committing military force. In fact, parliamentary committees have previously found quite the opposite. For example, in 2010, the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Legislation Committee published a report on the Defence Legislation Amendment, Parliamentary Approval of Overseas Service Bill 2014. And that Senate report highlighted several very significant concerns with potential parliamentary involvement in decisions on the deployment of ADF personnel overseas. So 3 main concerns that greatly troubled me with this proposal is that the committee highlighted very genuine concerns about the disclosure of sensitive or classified information. They also raised the concern with the lack of responsiveness and the lack of the ability of the parliament to respond quickly, particularly when confronted with the dynamic battle spaces that we have these days and how things need decisions very quickly. And also they identified that there was a lack of clarity around when the bill would apply and when these circumstances could be evoked. So that was in 2014, and I don't think anything has changed since then. In fact, I think the folly of this bill has actually been played out in many, many government decisions now dealing with Daesh and the consequences of their heinous behaviour. In fact, in the current security environment, the need for executive power over the use of military force is, as I said, more necessary than ever. And the National Security Committee of Cabinet has proved to be a very effective and very adept organisation of this executive, of the Cabinet, to make these decisions under both governments, this government and the previous government. Threats can no longer be easily characterised. Even sort of less than 50 years ago, it was still much easier to determine who a likely enemy might be. The armies of state dominated our security environment. But in the early period of the 21st century we now find ourselves in, this is absolutely not the case. Stateless enemies and terrorists using asymmetric tactics are an ever-increasing threat, as we're seeing daily in the Middle East and also now on our own shores. These threats demand the capacity to respond quickly and flexibly, and quite often, and in fact routinely, require operational security without the operational knowledge being out there in the general community and, of course, to our enemies. All 3 of these criteria would be all but impossible to meet if the executive was required to gain approval of Parliament every time it was to commit or change or adapt the utilisation of our military forces. And in fact, when you start to unpack and explore the practical implementations of this proposal, there are many credible scenarios relating to why it is not appropriate to require a parliamentary vote to commit our forces overseas. One simple example, but I think a very powerful example of this, is consider the situation of a prorogued parliament. If this legislation were to be in effect, it would be impossible to gain parliamentary approval and for quick and decisive military action to be taken. Now, as my colleague in the other place, Andrew Nikolic, noted recently, this situation has happened and is not hypothetical. In fact, it was in August 1914 when Australia went to war. At that time, federal parliament was prorogued. The government of Prime Minister Joseph Cook had been elected with a majority of 1, and a hostile Senate went to a double dissolution election in June 1914. Imagine the circumstance in 1914 if the executive hadn't been able to meet and around the wonderful table that now at the Museum of Parliamentary Democracy, in fact, sorry, the National Archives, and actually get round and quickly make the decisions it was needed to be. So clearly it was not in the national interest then for this sort of requirement to be in place, just as it is not in the national interest today. Even when you have a look at the detail, even if Parliament wasn't prorogued, having a look at how the practical circumstances and how the practical application of this would be, it would be almost impossible to implement. This would require a proclamation to be made. And consider a circumstance where the government does not want to know that forces are serving overseas for their own operational and personal security. Imagine a time when we've got a hostage rescue situation for Australian forces in Iraq or Syria, and we've got to mount a new operation. what do? Do we come to Parliament? Do we discuss it here? Do we let our enemies know what we're doing? Time is of the essence, and we may as well just sort of post everything from the National Security Committee on our website here, or set up a bulletin board to let our opponents and to let Daesh know what we're doing. There is, I think, not only a high possibility, but there is a very high probability that these requirements in practice, particularly in the current environment in the Middle East at the moment, in the Middle East era of operations that we're currently operating in, would put Australia's servicemen and women in absolute physical danger. For example, the bill that the Greens put forward last year, that we debated at some extent last year, would require that information on deployment would have to be provided to government within 2 days, even if forces are deploying on the pretence of secret intelligence or on information that cannot be publicly shared. I'll just say that again, because just think about the implications for our servicemen and women of what the Greens proposed last year in the bill to give effect to this motion today. Information on deployment would have to be provided to government within 2 days, even if forces are deploying on the pretence of secret intelligence or on information that cannot be publicly shared. As I said, why don't we just put everything up on the bulletin board, say to Daesh and any other enemy in the future, here we are, guys, this is what we're doing, we're coming to rescue our people, or we're coming to do these military operations. You know, that's really not a very safe or a very smart environment or a probable environment. So that's not the only thing that in their legislation last year they wanted, in their bill they wanted. So they also wanted it out there in the public, the reasons for the deployment, the geographical extent of the proposed deployment, the expected duration of the deployment and the numbers of members of the Defence Force proposed to be deployed. I cannot believe that they would actually want this information that would not only telling our enemies in a conventional war or in an asymmetrical war, such as that we're fighting Daesh at the moment. We want to tell them where we're going, when we're going, how many troops we're going to deploy, how long we're going to be there. What else does the enemy need to know to actually defeat us when we finally hit the ground? It is the most ludicrous proposal. It was ludicrous in my mind 12 months ago. And having a look at the nature of the threat of Daesh today, it is even more fanciful, but it's frightening to me that somebody would come into this place and really put forward a bill, and now motion, that we would telegraph to our enemies what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, where we were going to deploy our troops, how many we were going to deploy, what equipment they were deploying with. I mean, that is the strategy for them to defeat us. And I still find it unbelievable that anybody in this parliament would suggest such a thing. This notice of motion, I think, falls directly within the remit of findings of the Joint Standing Committee, and who identified the 3 key concerns with this approach. But it's worthy to note in this place and to remind senators in this place of what the Parliamentary Committee said. Much of the information under consideration and proposed by the Greens would be classified. For example, risks to personnel, defence or AFP assets, their strength, their location, their force readiness, as well as the level of commitment and capabilities of likely allies and the compatibility and complementarity of their forces. Clearly, much of this information could not be disclosed, and if so, would have the potential to compromise the safety and security of any proposed overseas operation or adversely affect the diplomatic relations with potential allies. Now, that's not the coalition senators saying this. This is the Parliamentary Committee that reviewed this same proposal from the Greens last year. It was absolutely true then, and it was just as ludicrous then as it is today. The Islamic State and Daesh is a situation and an enemy unlike anything we have ever faced. There is truly no way anybody can offer to hold hands with them and reason with them and talk messages of peace, because they do not understand that language, they do not respect compassion, they exploit it in the most horrifically gruesome ways. Rape, roasting people alive on TV, and all of the other horrendous things. And I think today we heard they were now selling their captives, not only selling them for sex, but actually selling men and women into slavery. This is an enemy that cannot be treated lightly, and it cannot be treated in the way that we may have treated other enemies. And we certainly will not win, not only for the Australian people to protect us, but the 11 million plus displaced Syrians will find no peace and no ability to go home until Daesh is destroyed. And Daesh doesn't respect borders. Daesh are not just in Iraq, they are also in Syria. So it is essential for our security, for security in the Middle East, and also for the Syrian refugees and all the millions of displaced Syrians, that we go in and we confront this enemy. And the ludicrousness of the Greens' bill last year, which is now reflected in this motion today, is that we would telegraph, and again I'll just repeat that, we would telegraph personnel details, defence and other AFP assets, their strengths, location, their force readiness, as well as the level of commitment and capabilities of our likely allies. So we're not only telegraphing, here's who we are, here's where we are, this is how we're going to come and get you, Daesh, but we would also be telegraphing that information for our allies. They wouldn't be our allies for very long, let me tell you. As I said, there is absolutely no other way to characterise the behaviour of these fighters of the Islamic State and Daesh. And I said we've all seen the horrific, not only the photos and the images of the pure evil these people are capable of. They don't understand compassion, they exploit it in the most heinous of ways. But there is no other way. There is no other way to defeat ISIS and to defeat Daesh. The use of military force is never a decision to be taken lightly. There will always be risks, but sometimes the risks of sitting back, watching and waiting, and watching the problem get worse, watching more and more people be killed, be raped, be beheaded, be roasted alive, and all of the other things that Daesh is now doing, quite publicly and wanting the whole world to see. There is no other way. There is no way that many millions of Syrians will be able to go back to their homes until IS and until Daesh has gone. So put it in this context, I find it hard to see how Australia has any other choice than to involve ourselves with our allies. And operations do change, and they have moved, and the enemy has moved further into Syria. And there is no question, if we want to deal with Daesh, we have to go into Syria with our allies and not just leave them to do the heavy lifting on our behalf. I fully believe that our intervention is humane, and it is on the side of the persecuted minorities who have been forced, those who have been lucky to survive, who have been forced to flee their own homelands. It is in conjunction with our allies and our partners, and it is under the purview of the United Nations. While it may be centred on the Middle East, 1,000 kilometres away, it clearly has an impact on the security of Australians. It is incumbent upon all of us to do what is right to combat evil and to protect those who are at risk of violence and subjugation at the hands of people as evil as Daesh. It is our obligation not only to protect our own people, but as human beings to do what we can to protect the people of Syria. The Greens' opposition to the deployment of the Australian Defence Force in conflict zones is nothing new. We saw that with the bill that they proposed last year. In fact, if my recollection is correct, one of my Green Senator colleagues in the chamber currently, and I think I'll quote this, said, "Terrorist is a word that is very commonly used against us by the same people in Iraq who have been radicalised, and that anything that creates terror is by definition terrorism. And terrorism in the context of national security has a specific meaning." And my understanding of Senator Whish-Wilson's word at the time was that we ourselves, by what we're doing to help the Iraqis and Syrians, our own men and women in uniform could be construed as terrorists. I found that offensive then, and I find it just as offensive today. Mr Acting Deputy President, the decision to deploy members of the Australian Defence Force has consistently been regarded as a fundamental decision of the Executive
today. Senator Reynolds.
It has always been and always should be.
Has now expired.